Hello everybody. Today we are discussing World War II from the perspective of Soviet politics. This means I'm not going to talk a lot about army sizes or numbers of tanks uses. That stuff is not my field and there are way better videos about it anyways. Instead, I will talk about the internal leadership and politics that eventually turned the invasion of the USSR and ended up causing the defeat of fascism as a major ideology in Europe. Say about the USSR what you want, but this was undeniably a good thing. It stopped the Holocaust and Hitler's other genocidal plans. Now, some of you may point out that it wasn't the USSR alone that defeated fascism, and you would be partially correct. France, the US and the UK also did some parts. But it has to be acknowledged that by the time the Allies finally got boots on the ground in Europe, the USSR had been holding back the fascists for 3 years, with only minor support in the form of bombers destroying German population centers and Lend-Lease. On top of that, the Soviet Union conscripted more people than the entirety of the Western Allies. They had 30 million men in the field. That's 1 in 6 Soviet citizens. And when it comes to casualty, the Western Allies collectively lost about 1 million men. The Soviets lost 8.5. Now you may think that this is because the Soviets were bad at tactics and that the NKVD shot people in the back for not advancing, but we'll get to that myth. Another proof that the Soviets were the major power defeating Germany is this poll. Right after the war, most people considered the USSR to have done the most to defeat fascism. And this was in France, which is an ally of US in decay, not explicitly the USSR. But over time, as we always hear, the USA liberated Europe, so when the memories of the war and the reports of Soviet advances faded in the collective memory, most of us get our war information from media. And in the West, that is overwhelmingly stories of Americans liberating Western Europe. So now, many underestimate just how huge it was that the USSR could stop the Wehrmacht and drain its resources enough to allow the Allies to land in Sicily and Normandy. So, now that I justified the title, it's time to start. Right after you subscribe and support your local small businesses, like me. I'm legally a business now, so bye-bye to my taxes, I guess. Well, either way, we start before the war. As you know, by the time the Nazis were in power in Germany, Lenin was dead and Stalin was ruling. And Stalin went about doing what Lenin said the state should do, and industrialized. See, the former Russian Empire was mostly entirely agrarian. So, for all modern products like machinery and things like trucks, tanks and railways had to be imported. This is an issue, since the USSR, especially under Stalin, did not want to rely on capitalist states to trade with them. So, they built up their heavy industry. Their coal and iron production, they brought tractors to farms, so fewer farmers were needed in the fields, and the newly freed up labor could be put to work in factories, which increased the standards of living, and as a side effect, the USSR becoming more self-reliant. It would be able to defend itself, which is critical for Stalin's doctrine of socialism in one country. If you look at this chart, you can really tell how much the USSR changed immediately before the war. They increased the production of metal cutting machines by 2,400% and car production by 25,000% within 9 years. The USSR was becoming a superpower really fast. Of course, before we get to the war, there was another important political event in the Soviet Union, and that was Stalin's purges. Very basically, Stalin tried to erase the leftover people from other factions like Trotskyists. He was very obsessed with factionalism since he saw internal rebellion as the only threat to the stability of the Soviet Union. Along with this, many military officials didn't 100% agree with the way Stalin ran the country. These are a bunch of legitimate concerns Stalin may have had, and he solved it by imprisoning everyone accused into gulags. This was of course more like a slave labor camp than a death camp, but it was absolutely horrible. If you make videos and want the topic, talk about Stalin's purges, because I'm done poking that hornet's nest now. Except for this detail here. The conviction rate of all those accused of being counter-revolutionary by Stalin was only 53%, which is a lot lower than I thought it would be. By 1938, Stalin had purged many of the top military officials and had continued industrialization. Meanwhile, in Germany, the fascists had legally built up their army and annexed Austria, and now they demanded to take this region of Czechoslovakia, because it had German minorities there. Eventually, Hitler got what he wanted in return for not invading the rest of Czechoslovakia, which he immediately invaded. He had one big fear when it came to his plans of taking over all of Europe and destroying the Jewish people and Bolsheviks. A two-front war. That's what caused Germany's defeat in World War I, so they would make plans now. They needed to guarantee that the USSR would not intervene while the Wehrmacht was busy in France, so they suggested a deal to the Soviets. There would be peace between the two countries, and they would agree on who would control what country in their sphere, and where the German-Soviet border was going to be. This part of the agreement was of course secret. For the USSR, this was an interesting offer. As I mentioned before, they still industrialized by 1939 when these talks happened, and the USSR would likely have lost to the Germans if a war broke out. So this non-aggression pact was a way to get more time to industrialize and build up the army, especially the leadership, since the whole thing was purged. A lot of people taking this signing of the pact who mean that the Soviet leadership, or often just Stalin himself, were naive to trust fascists. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think the new war between fascism and communism was inevitable. The propaganda on both sides gave away that much. But I think the Soviets wanted to delay the war as far as possible, because with increasing industry, they would be stronger and stronger every day. Plus, they would get a bunch of former Russian lands in Eastern Europe. On September 4th, 1939, the German Wehrmacht opened fire against the Polish army. The UK and France had said that they would intervene for the protection of Poland, so they declared war on Germany in return. 2 weeks later, when barely anything of the Polish army was left, the Red Army also crossed the Polish border and took the lands they were promised in the Molotov Pact. Then, while Germany was going wild in the West, blitzkrieging, there were secret negotiations between the Soviets and the Germans. And it was about whether the USSR could join the Axis. That is the alliance of the fascist countries. This was a proposal by Hitler himself. It tried to promise lands to the Soviets, but the negotiations broke down after Stalin sent Hitler a list of things he wants before joining the Axis, and then there was no reply. Just be clear that when the Germans suggested the USSR join the Axis, they just wanted the Soviets to put their guard down before the invasion, which they had talked about for the past decade. In the USSR, on the other hand, this idea was likely taken to mean that the USSR would gain even more time to prepare for the inevitable war. The Soviet Axis talks are some of the strangest things I ever read about, but realistically, they could have never gotten anywhere. About 3 months after the invasion of Poland, the Soviets were frustrated. Since before the war, the USSR routinely sent envoys to Finland to try to work out some kind of deal about defense and military cooperations. The Finnish repeated their stance as a neutral country not willing to take part in any future wars. When the USSR continued to build up the Red Army, they were more and more noticing that the border with Finland, which was decided by Lenin in 1917, was really not great for the USSR, because the border was here, extremely close to the very important city of Leningrad, formerly Petrograd. Eventually, the USSR suggested something to Finland. Move the border a further 30 kilometers away from Leningrad, and in return they can have these two provinces. The Finnish declined the trade. So, because this was considered a potential opening for an invasion right into Leningrad, the Red Army was mobilized to take the land by force. It went horribly, the tactics were not great, the new leadership of the army was way worse than the ones they had before the trials. Because of all that and the weather and the invention of the Molotov cocktail, the Soviets had difficulty advancing. Eventually, after 3 months, they agreed on a ceasefire and the USSR would gain all land that is read on this map. And no, Finland did not get the land Russia had offered to trade. You know, for a video of me praising the USSR for destroying fascism, I'm sure mentioning many not great things the USSR did, but I guess that's reality. It's not black and white. Sometimes the Red Army just invaded smaller countries to move the border 50 kilometers and caused 200,000 casualties. in the name of the people. When eventually 1941 came around, the USSR was still in the process of industrialization and building up the military. I once heard that they estimated that by 1943 they could defeat Germany. Of course, at the same time the Nazis had conquered the Benelux states, half of Scandinavia and France. However, they were still at war with the United Kingdom that stubbornly refused to surrender. When spy reports came in that said that the Wehrmacht was amassing at the Soviet border, Stalin and his inner circle didn't consider it an immediate threat. Stalin was convinced that Germany would take out Britain before attacking the USSR in a land war. Unbeknownst to them, the Germans decided to take out Britain using bombers, not armies, so the entire Wehrmacht was free for Hitler's ultimate goal: the conquest, genocide and settlement of Soviet lands. When there were more and more reports of Germans on the border, Stalin sent more and more soldiers west and told them to expect a German invasion. But he did not mobilize the whole army, because he believed it may cause the Germans to start a preemptive strike. And remember, Stalin was trying to delay the war as much as possible. Eventually, in June of 1941, Hitler broke the non-aggression pact and sent the Wehrmacht into Soviet territory to carry out the Nazi genocidal project. There are stories that Stalin hid in frustration and talked to nobody during the early days of the invasion because he was scared or something. That account is from Khrushchev, the man who infamously didn't like Stalin. And it's contradicted by the fact that Stalin was giving out orders during the time where he was supposedly hiding and neither talking nor working. Stalin did what was most important and declared himself Marshal, that's the highest military rank. He made himself Supreme Commander-in-Chief, a People's Commissar of Defense, and he founded the Committee of National Defense and made himself the chairman, and even more. Clearly, he had his priorities straight. For the initial stages of the war, the USSR was doing badly. Part of it was the lack of mobilization of the army, a lack of preparation for defending against Blitzkrieg, and the fact that their military theory just kind of sucked. So Stalin immediately took over most military organizations himself, giving him the most power of any individual during the entirety of World War II. The Red Army also conducted many counteroffensives during these early stages. The issue was the lack of tanks to use, so they would inevitably be pushed back by the German counterattacks. Now, during this stage, lots of land was lost because of local commanders. A platoon leader would fortify an area, and rather than defend it to the last man, they would retreat a few miles and set up a new position there. And repeat. The thinking of these commanders was that the USSR was huge and could sacrifice land, but very quickly, Russian population centers like Moscow and Leningrad were in danger of being taken by the enemy. It didn't exactly help that the Finnish joined the Germans because the USSR invaded them a year earlier, so that land grab just got them another enemy. Eventually, in the winter of 41 and 42, the Germans got stuck, both because of the heavy winter and because they sort of destroyed most infrastructure when advancing. Not to mention their supply lines were overextended. So, for the winter they held positions, ignoring the fact that many of them were freezing. In the summer of the next year, they continued their advance towards Stalingrad to get that oil. Then, again, Stalin had the issue with local commanders just disobeying orders and retreating. So he gave Order 227, also called the No Step Back Directive. If you've seen this god-awful movie, you may think that this meant that the NKVD was taking machine gun positions behind their attacking soldiers and shot them in the back for not charging machine gun nests. This is not how it worked. Individual soldiers were always allowed back to their lines after an attack. It was just that the commanders were expressively told not to retreat unauthorized, or else the NKVD would court-martial them for disobeying orders. Yes, sometimes the outcome of the court-martial was an execution, but not nearly as often as media would have you believe, and it was an actual justice system, not just random murder. You may wonder what happened to all the industry that Stalin put up before the war, and what about the people who lived in the West? Well, they evacuated. 16 million people fled from the advancing Wehrmacht. And of course, Stalin didn't want to give up the industry, since making new tanks, guns, planes and ammo would be critical for his war effort. So I raise you this question. What is most important about a factory? What do you need for it to work? Well, you don't necessarily need that specific building. You just need the machinery in a building and people knowing how to run it. So what if you just take the industry and put it into a safer place? To my knowledge, nothing like that was ever attempted or carried out in history before or after this point. But with the incredible control and efficiency that came with the centrally planned economy, it was possible. 3,500 factories were moved to the Urals and even further east within 9 months. That is 55 entire factories a day. Moved 1,000 kilometers and reassembled. Hitler was banking on taking over most of the Russian industry by this point, destabilizing the country. But he underestimated the power of a socialist economy. Eventually, the Soviet economy would outproduce the German one. Interestingly, in 1941, Stalin already talked to the British about the post-war settlement. Meaning even in 1941, when they were pretty much losing, the Soviet leadership already foresaw the victory, which I found surprising. Likewise, in 1941, Stalin held a speech in front of military officials saying that the Nazis would lose because they're underestimating the power of the Red Army. And he was completely right. The Germans thought it would be like World War I. They would invade a bit and then a revolution breaks out and there is no more effective resistance, so they can take all land up to the Urals. Clearly, they underestimated the political conviction of Soviet soldiers and leadership. The fact that Stalin removed so many people whose loyalty was questionable at the time may or may not have played a part in keeping the country together in these hardest of times. At this time, the Germans were making a push to Moscow, but Siberian winter specialized troops pushed back the German advance squads. These troops were freed because Japan, which was at war with China and soon to be the USA, signed a non-aggression treaty with the USSR, allowing them to use their Far East units in the West to defend Moscow. By 1942, Japan brought the US into the war, so Germany had a big problem. There could be an invasion of the West, so they moved 20% of their units to the coastlines of Europe to defeat any amphibious landings before the beachhead is established. Yes, even with the impending threat of invasion, the Germans still kept 80% of their troops in the east, almost as if they knew that the USSR was the largest and strongest enemy most likely to defeat them. When the sieges of Stalingrad and Leningrad were turning out as Soviet victories, Stalin completely changed course on religion. He opened all churches, invited the patriarchs, and formed a patriarchate in Moscow. Officially because he received a vision from God, unofficially to mobilize Christian people to fight more for the USSR. This is remarkable because Stalin was the one who originally closed all the churches, so I guess that's revisionism. When 1943 came around, the front line was steadily moving west, towards Germany. This was because of a huge increase in the size of the Red Army, a better industry in the Soviet Union, and the fact that the Germans were losing troops to anti-aircraft duty in every population center because the Allies somehow decided that war crimes are a great way to make people look forward to the liberation armies. While Stalin gave himself all the power to control everything about the war economy, he actually didn't touch it that much. Instead, he delegated that to his economic experts, who had run the economy since the new economic policy under Lenin. Curiously, there is a myth that Stalin wanted to negotiate a peace with Germany in 1941 or 1942, but literally no documentation exists of this, so most likely never happened. And I don't entirely see why Stalin would have negotiated. As I mentioned before, as early as 1941, Stalin was confident he would win the war. But by 1944, it was blindingly obvious that Germany was going to lose. In addition to the USSR taking back all the land that they had lost, the Allies finally showed up on the continent, after invading Sicily, Normandy, and whatever you call this part of France. As the USSR kept going, they wanted to take Warsaw, but unfortunately the Germans completely rearmed their army group there, so the Soviets were stopped from advancing while outside of the city. Seeing the Red Army approach, the underground rebels of Warsaw took this as their cue to rise up against the Germans, expecting Soviet support. That support never came. To this day, people argue if the Red Army stopped on purpose to let the Germans kill the Poles, or whether it was genuinely stopped by the Wehrmacht. Eventually, the USSR, UK and USA met in Yalta to discuss the occupation zones and post-war borders. The USSR would occupy and rebuild this area, and the Western Allies would occupy and rebuild this area. As you can tell, Germany is divided, but this is definitely only temporary for a couple of years. And look at that, we're already at the point where this video ends and the Cold War video begins. Isn't that nice? I would like to thank every one of you that financially supported me in the last 6 weeks when I was at the hospital. And thanks to anyone who continues to support me, be it financially, leaving likes, subscribing, or sending this video to anyone you know is interested in history. And of course, thanks to those who donate so generously, who are Theo Hartley, Potato God 777, Alan Vo, Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, V, Sander Corvus, Attila Nemetz, Carissa, Comrade Falcon, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Corozelli, DSM5 is better than ICD-10, Emily Margot Klassen, Evie, Ren, Herdina, Josh C, Plastrup, Liam S, Lilith Craft, Mamuka Tiliari, Marxism Tonight, Nane Bema, Poet, Raymond DeVille, Red Shock Truba, Sean Murphy, Stemmaster Chef, Taylor CH, Theon Gilliard Jr., and Trey.